Hello, this is Alan C. Guelzo, the Senior Research Scholar in the Council of the Humanities at Princeton University, and the Director of the Initiative on Politics and Statesmanship at the university's James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. And I'd like to talk to you today about the 1619 Project. The first question, of course, is what is the 1619 Project? We're not talking about a revolutionary scientific endeavor like the Manhattan Project or the Artemis Project, which hopes to launch a live expedition back to the moon by 2024. The 1619 Project is actually a journalistic initiative contained in a 100-page issue of the New York Times Magazine under the general direction of Nicole Hannah-Jones in August of 2019. And it collects articles, poetry, and fiction designed to recenter American history around the experience of slavery. Now, prosaic as that may sound at first, especially compared to those other two projects, it certainly has a revolutionary punch all of its own. Since the 1619 Project is conceived as a national initiative to recast the teaching of American history to students in K through 12 classrooms across the country in a sharply hostile light, that recasting is evident in the very title of the project, since Hannah-Jones believes that 1619 and not 1776 represents the real founding of America. The year 1619, of course, is the year when African slaves were first introduced into colonial Virginia. It is from that moment that the real American history begins for the 1619 Project, because every development in American history since 1619 has either rested on the exploitation of Black slaves and their descendants today, or followed a pattern of anti-Black hostility. No aspect of the country that would be formed here has been untouched by the years of slavery that followed, wrote Hannah-Jones. Out of slavery and the anti-Black racism it required grew nearly everything that has truly made America exceptional. Its economic might, its industrial power, its electoral system, its diet and popular music, the inequities of its public health and education, its astonishing penchant for violence, its income inequality, the example it sets for the world as a land of freedom and equality, its slang, its legal system, and the endemic racial fears and hatreds that continue to plague it to this day. I have been a history teacher for most of my life. And if there is one lesson I have learned in that time, it is to mistrust single explanation theories of history, the sort that latch on to a single person, a single development, sometimes a single group, and with a great aha, propose to explain everything by that one explanation. Historical theories that purport to explain everything usually wind up explaining nothing, because human history is too complicated. It's too filled with too many different moving parts to be the result of just one single cause. What's more, single cause historical theories have a nasty habit of shading over into conspiracy theories like the grassy knoll or the kulaks, or the protocols of the elders of Zion. And like the latter two of those, the results, when people are persuaded to take such theories seriously, have been disastrous. So my first instinct in confronting the 1619 Project was simply to dismiss it as yet another dreary, one-size-fits-all explanation that explained little, if anything. And in truth, most of the contributors to the 1619 Project are journalists, not historians. I know that journalists like to speak of themselves as writing the first draft of history. Well, having done a fair bit of journalism myself, I would respond to that in Shakespeare's words. Lay not that flattering unction to your soul. We historians usually spend a large bit of our careers correcting that first draft. But the 1619 Project has been nothing if not ambitious. With the cooperation of the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, the 1619 Project has been adopted as a K through 12 history curriculum in over 3,500 American classrooms and at least 3 major urban school districts, and is being expanded for still wider distribution by the Pulitzer Center into reading guides, lesson plans, and extension activities for classrooms. And what the 1619 Project proposes as the new center of American history teaching is so riddled with errors that numerous prominent historians, among which number Gordon Wood, James McPherson, Sean Wilentz, Richard Carberdine, James Oakes, and many others, have indicated alarm at the galaxy of errors, misconstructions, and gross mishandlings of the American historical record by the 1619 Project. So perhaps it's worth taking a few minutes to itemize just how egregious the 1619 Project's overreach has been. Let's begin with the date, 1619. Actually, the first African slaves to be deposited on the shores of North America arrived not in 1619, but 1529, as part of an unsuccessful colonizing venture of the Spanish on the Georgia coast. Now, that may seem like a small hair to split, but it does emphasize an important overarching concept. Slavery was planted here long before the United States existed. Slavery, in fact, had been going on for a long time before Europeans began making serious colonizing efforts in North America. And the places where it flourished were the Western African kingdoms of Mali, the Ashanti, and the Congo. Europeans cruised those coasts, hunting for slave labor, but they did so because the Western African kingdoms obliged their hunting. Moreover, slave labor was imported into the English-speaking colonies alongside European convict and indentured labor, whose terms did not differ all that much from slavery. But the real mischaracterization of the date 1619 is that 1619 represents an end, not, as the 1619 Project would have it, a beginning. The new society that was built in 17th century Virginia around slave labor would be, as it turned out, the last new society in human history that took slavery for granted as a labor system. This is because the 17th century was also the century that saw the birth of the Enlightenment, of new ways of conceiving the physical universe around the natural laws described by Galileo and Newton, and of new ways of conceiving the structure of human society, no longer as a pyramid with kings on top and the people on the bottom, but a society of equals, possessing equal rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thus, 1619 represents the last outpost of an old world, and the new world that would be born, the world that would lead to the abolition of slavery and the dismissal of race as any kind of worthwhile factor in measuring human dignity, that began in 1776. It is the 1776 world we live in today, not the 1619 world. But that only lays out what I consider to be the big picture error of the 1619 Project. There are plenty of problems with the historical details of the 1619 Project as well. In the 1619 Project's lead essay, Hannah Jones asserts that one of the primary reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence from Great Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. Hence, the American Revolution was fought Not for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or because all men are created equal, but in order to keep British overlords from meddling with American slavery. Hannah-Jones rests this assertion on the famous 1772 Somerset Decision, in which Britain's Lord Chief Justice Mansfield ordered the freeing of a slave brought into England, James Somerset, on the grounds that slavery was not a legal condition in the British Isles. This decision is supposed to have stimulated a panic among slaveholders in the American colonies and incited them to bolt for independence before Somerset could be applied to them. Britain had grown deeply conflicted over its role in the barbaric institution, writes Hannah-Jones, thus leading American slaveholders to dread growing calls to abolish the slave trade and to resort to revolution to save it. There are, however, two forbidding problems with this assertion. First, as a number of prominent historians of early America have replied in astonishment, there is no evidence that the Somerset Decision played a role in any American's decision to support the revolution, or even that many Americans noticed it. The largest resistance to Somerset came from slave owners in the British West Indies, where slavery was conducted on a far larger scale and for far greater profits in sugar. Yet, the British West Indies chose deliberately not to join the American revolutionaries in 1776. If defending slavery from Somerset was the real issue of 1776, no one should have been more eager to throw in their lot with the 13 North American colonies than the British West Indies. But they did not. So far from defending slavery was the minds of the American Revolution that one historian whom Hannah-Jones did consult, Leslie M. Harris of Northwestern University, advised Hannah-Jones not to make this assertion. And when Hannah-Jones ignored this advice, Harris, in March 2020, went public with her complaint in Politico, and the New York Times Magazine was forced to concede the error in a humiliating update on March 11th. But Hannah-Jones' lead essay was not the only contribution that was long on passion but short on reality. Sociologist Matthew Desmond picked up the thread of Slavery Explains Everything in an essay claiming that American capitalism is brutal. You can trace that to the plantation. The cotton houses and slave auction blocks of the American South, Desmond wrote, are the birthplace of America's low-road approach to capitalism, where inequality reigns and poverty spreads. Desmond's proof is a version of guilt by association. Slave plantations used vertical reporting systems, double entry record keeping, and precise quantification to extract the maximum amounts of profit from slave labor. Slavery's violence was neither arbitrary nor gratuitous. It was instead rational, capitalistic. Ergo, capitalism is actually slavery. Yet, the mistakes in Desmond's essay lie just as close to the surface as those in Hannah-Jones. Double entry bookkeeping was an innovation of the Italian Renaissance, long before there was any economic system we would call capitalism, or even Southern slavery. The Portuguese and Spanish empires of the 16th century were built on slave labor, but no one has ever accused them of being capitalistic enterprises. Nearer in time, the Soviet Union conducted fully a quarter of its foreign trade with Western European capitalist economies. None of that made the Soviet Union capitalistic, or even a quarter capitalistic. Southern slavery was indeed profitable, not because it was slavery, but because it dealt in the most desirable commodity in the 19th century Atlantic world, cotton. But profits are not capitalism, and every other aspect of slavery pointed in the opposite direction from capitalism. But the most destructive hammer against Desmond's argument was wielded by the slaveholders themselves, since Southern slaveholders were capitalism's most energetic critics, declaring in the 1850s that the unrestricted exploitation of so-called free society is more oppressive to the laborer than domestic slavery. On those terms, the pro-slavery apologist, George Fitzhugh, could boast that a Southern farm is the beau ideal of communism, not capitalism, where each, in good Marxist fashion, receives not according to his labor, but according to his wants. What foreign observers noticed first about the South was not capitalism, but its absence. Nor did Southerners themselves try to make it appear otherwise. If anything, they dwelt in what they imagined was a feudal economy, not a capitalistic one. James Walker, a Charleston lawyer, went so far as to insist that ours is in truth not so much slavery as feudality. I cite the errors in Hannah Jones and Desmond's essays only as containing two of the most obvious blunders in the 1619 Project. I could go on, but at the risk of making this sound like one of those academic quarrels that fill up long, unread footnotes. Why is the 1619 Project important at all? Or more to the point, why is it important to understand that it's so wrong-headed? Well, the first reason is that history matters to Americans. I mean, forget Henry Ford's line about history being bunk. Our history really is vital to us because our identity as Americans is not based on blood or soil or language or religion, but on the propositions of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the way we have fought for freedom in the Revolution, the Civil War, and 2 world wars. If those propositions and that freedom are not the basis of our identity, then confidence in the entire American experiment in liberty is in jeopardy. A democracy which is built on the propositions of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution cannot function if its children are taught that its founding was nothing more than a cynical ploy for white men to oppress black slaves. The second reason why it's important to understand this is because the 1619 Project's claims that the American economy is an example of low-road capitalism based on the model of the slave plantation leaves us with the suspicion that capitalism is somehow tainted by slavery. The logical alternative will, of course, be for Americans, and especially younger Americans who have nothing to compare this to embrace some form of socialism. If a capitalist economy can be tainted in school curriculums by an association with slavery, then it becomes easier to recommend socialism as the alternative to the rising generation of Americans. Happily, there are options. There are curriculums which present more balanced approaches. And for the upper grades, there is Wilfred Maclay's wonderful New American History, Land of Hope, an invitation to the great American story. And there is no need to overbalance the 1619 Project by going to extremes which claim that Americans have always done well and always virtuously. Even Abraham Lincoln reminded us that we are imperfect in reaching the goals of liberty and justice. The important thing is to understand how our principles guide us to realizing them more and more. And I suspect that even Nicole Hannah-Jones might agree with that. Thanks for joining this session of the Napa Institute Conference. If you'd like to learn some more, please visit me at www.alanguelzo, that's spelled ALLENGUELZO.com.